Hi, I'm Lei Shen, a Senior Associate in Mayer Brown's Cybersecurity and Data Privacy and Technology Transactions Group. I'm joined by my colleague, Oliver Yaros, who is a partner in Mayer Brown's Cybersecurity and Data Privacy and Technology Transactions Group. Oliver and I are pleased to introduce our chapter on preparing for the EU's new data protection regulation in Mayer Brown's new guidebook. As part of National Cybersecurity Awareness Month this year, Mayer Brown is releasing a new practical guide titled Staying Ahead of the Curve, Cybersecurity and Data Privacy, Hot Topics for Global Business. This guide explores the unique legal challenges arising in several emerging and cutting-edge topic areas related to cybersecurity and data privacy around the world, including a chapter on preparing for the EU's new General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR. The GDPR chapter in the guide will discuss what the GDPR is, what the key changes are from the EU Directive, and what companies should be doing to comply with the GDPR. The new EU GDPR will replace the current EU Directive in May 2018. It will introduce significant changes and additional requirements that will have a wide-ranging impact on businesses around the world, even if they do not operate in the European Union. One of the key changes in the GDPR is that it is a regulation rather than a directive. This means that it does not need to be implemented by each EU member state, but rather is directly applicable to each member state, allowing for more consistency. Another significant change in the GDPR is that the GDPR will apply not only to businesses that are established in the European Union, but also to any organizations that are located outside of the European Union that process personal data in relation to the offer of goods or services to individuals within the EU, or as a result of monitoring individuals within the European Union. Fines for noncompliance are also increased significantly in the GDPR. The maximum fine for noncompliance will be up to 4% of an enterprise's worldwide turnover, or 20 million euro, whichever is higher. There are also new data breach notification obligations in the GDPR. Organizations will be required to notify the relevant EU Data Protection Authority of a data breach without undue delay and, where feasible, within 72 hours, and notify affected individuals without undue delay. Organizations will be required to implement privacy by design to ensure that an appropriate level of data protection is provided by default when personal data is being processed. Some organizations will be required to map their personal data processing and to undertake data protection impact assessments. The GDPR adds some new data subject rights, including the right to be forgotten and the right to data portability. The GDPR also adds several requirements regarding what needs to be included in a contract with a processor that were not required by the EU Directive, such as the requirement to delete or return all personal data to the controller at the end of the provision of the services relating to the processing.
Thank you, Lei. Following on from those requirements, this is what businesses need to do to get ready to comply with the GDPR. The first step for most organizations will be to formulate a plan for what needs to be changed within an organization to get ready to comply with the GDPR. As the second step, organizations will need to create a record of the personal data that they are processing, and in order to create that record, they will need to assess what personal data they have, who that personal data is about, what categories of personal data it is, and what organizations that personal data is being shared with. As a third step, organizations will need to consider the grounds that are being relied on to process personal data and whether those grounds can still be relied on under the GDPR, and if there are any risks from the processing activities that are being conducted, how those risks can be mitigated using an impact assessment, for example. Organizations will need to consider whether they have to appoint a data protection officer and whether any new compliance systems need to be implemented to allow organizations to respond to requests for copies of personal data from individuals or to be provided with a copy of personal data. Organizations will need to consider whether their data protection policy or other data governance procedures need to be updated. They'll also need to consider how the supply chain contracts that an organization might have and other agreements that an organization might have with its customers, for example, need to be updated to comply with the GDPR, in particular where organizations are transferring personal data internationally. With the GDPR in mind, Lei Shen and I are actually presenting a webinar on the 6th of December about how organizations can review and prepare their supplier agreements for the GDPR. That webinar will address an overview of the GDPR, any new guidance that is provided by the Article 29 Working Party and other EU data protection authorities, and also the steps that organizations should consider taking to get their agreements with third parties ready for the GDPR. Thank you for listening, and we hope you join us then.